You know, I used to tell the story of this one gamer that I knew that really did not like 3D. They would play arcade games and they would play the earlier 2D stuff, but they had some weird aversion to specifically 3D. This included claiming Final Fantasy died after 6 because it went 3D. Did it matter that the games were, gameplay-wise, actually quite similar? Clearly not to them. The story was funny because I thought it was one person's wacky take. Sadly, I was wrong. But while all of this was going on, back in 2024, I made a video calling the 5th generation of consoles overlooked, and I had comments telling me that I was wrong, that the consoles were quite popular and beloved. Were these comments wrong? Well, no. You see, the 5th generation of consoles has only been getting more and more appreciated as time goes on, both by older folks and by younger ones, like Zoomers, like me. But there's this ghost, a wraith even, haunting the 5th generation of console hardware, trying to ward off curious travelers from experiencing this generation of hardware. The Millennial Menace. I'm only half joking. Millennials have a bit of a problem with how they view the game console generations. You see, millennials were born between 1981 and 1996. The younger ones are usually the ones who have the good takes, and the older ones usually have the bad ones. Let me explain. Let's say you were born in, 1985. Gaming consoles weren't something you would buy on release. The N64 released in 1996, but most kids didn't really have it until 1998 or 1999 in some cases. So, you could imagine how a kid born in the mid-80s experienced a relatively linear evolution of consoles. Maybe they had an NES or an SNES, then they grew up to see the N64 or PlayStation, then the PS2 or GameCube, and finally, in their 20s, they got to see the PS3 and 360. They basically went from quite basic 2D stuff all the way up to online and HD gaming. It creates this idea of a linear progression of technology and capabilities. Because of this, they see the 3rd generation as a stepping stone to the 4th, 4th to the 5th, 5th to the 6th, and so on. But because the 5th generation went 3D, something that was nearly impossible to do beforehand, there's a cutoff point here. A cutoff point that isn't really seen in other console generations. 3D was such a massive game changer, and many of their early childhood games were just sort of left behind in a sense. Going from Mario 3D World to Mario 64, you can see how it's a bit of a jarring jump in terms of, well, everything. And so because of that, and because the 5th generation of graphics is rather geometrically simple, a lot of these people will just write it off as archaic or old. They have nostalgia for a previous generation of games, something they played as kids, and a far lesser amount of nostalgia for a generation they might have played as teenagers. This is of course different from somebody who may be a Zoomer, for instance, who can see things from a modern perspective, removed from the nostalgia, and can sort of see every single generation beforehand for what they really are, and not for what they specifically meant to them. And of course, as you may imagine, the millennial mindset is of course absolutely stupid, anti-art, and I could go on. But I don't think I need to explain just how ignoring the artistry and merit of an entire console generation, especially one so full of new and unique experiences, is wrong. So instead, I would like to explain why the 5th generation of gaming was so extremely important, both for gaming, but also for developers. In the days before the 5th generation, 3D wasn't really a choice most developers had. I mean, sure, you had the occasional enhancement chip for a video game system, some arcade boards, or maybe the occasional PC release, but 2D was still what basically every developer used. Then the PlayStation released, and also the Saturn, and later the Nintendo 64. There were some previous ones, they don't matter here, because the PlayStation had Kingsfield on it. While sure, it may look a little bit dated compared to modern graphics, the 5th generation of consoles was the first time a game like Kingsfield was even allowed to exist. something that would have been theoretically possible on previous systems, but just not the same if it's released on something like the SNES. And this is something that continued in the life of these systems. In 1995, Jumping Flash released, a game that would have been flatly impossible in a 2D system. And sure, you could maybe have a game that was sort of similar-ish to it in a 2D isometric view, but you can also understand how it just wouldn't be the same. It's the same story with Panzer Dragoon and its sequel. It would have been, in some ways, possible on a last generation system, but it wouldn't be even close to the 3D Panzer Dragoon games that we actually got. Then in 1996 you had Resident Evil, Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider on PlayStation, Mario 64 on the N64. In 1997 you had Final Fantasy VII, Gran Turismo, and the story with all of these stays the same. Sure, there could be a potential theoretical version of these games that was built in 2D, but they'd be vastly inferior to their complete existing versions. This is because all of these games were built to be 3D, and therefore benefit from 3D in ways that are completely unique to the third dimension. They're more expressive, in a sense. RE2 definitely wouldn't hit the same in 2D. Yeah, the Rook. Okay. And I de-equipped the gun. Good. Oh, I'm not dealing with you. Fuck off. But did they age well? That's a trick question. Games don't age. They're exactly as good, or bad, or mediocre as they were back when they released. Of course, if we're judging them by modern standards, they're not going to maybe beat any records connected to their graphical fidelity, but they don't have to. You may have noticed that I don't run any of the games here in an upscaled format, and that's for a very important reason. Console games are designed to run in their native system resolution. Upscaling these games makes them run at a resolution they were never intended to run on, and it kinda gives the same effect as watching an AI upscaled Ghibli film, except you get visual bugs from the game not being designed for it, instead of because of the evil stochastic visual hallucination machine that doesn't know what it's doing. It's nowhere near as bad in a visual sense, but you're still robbing yourself of the intended experience. The art in all of these games was designed around them being played in their original resolutions. Games that look odd when you run them upscaled, like those that mesh 2D or 3D assets, still look great in their intended resolutions. They look great because fidelity just isn't the same as artistry. It may be related in some cases, but it isn't. A photo of the night sky is not, in fact, a more beautiful version of a painting purely because it's a high resolution. I mean, we already make fun of people who use those shitty upscaling filters on SNES games, so why not extend that a little bit further to making fun of whatever this is? Regardless, there's beauty and artistry to these graphics, just like with all games, and if someone doesn't respect games like these for whatever reason, it just shows they don't know what they're talking about. But there's an argument that I often hear. The rise of 3D gaming killed 2D for a time, and even today, 2D hasn't really recovered. And that's not wrong. I mean, off the top of my head, I can name Drolancer as a series of 2D PS2 games, and that's about it. But it's also not fair to really blame 3D games for this. Let's go back to the 5th generation. We still had a decent chunk of 2D games coming out, especially on the Saturn, PlayStation, and PC. So, what changed? Well, a few things. Firstly, the developers were absolutely ecstatic to try out 3D. The developers who were so excited were, of course, the ones who would then end up making many of the revolutionary 3D games I mentioned earlier. 3D was just so new and exciting that basically everyone wanted more of it, both gamers and developers. Just having the ability to play around with the new 3D tech and the opportunities it allowed for, immersion, cinematics, deeper gameplay opportunities, all of this sort of left 2D in the dust for a lot of developers. But again, it's not like 2D gaming was dead or something. 2D games were still coming out, maybe less of them like Arc the Lad or Symphony of the Night, but there was also a secret third option, mixed mode games. Games like Xenogears, Star Ocean 2 or Final Fantasy Tactics were all at some level of between 2D and 3D. They had way too much 3D to be 2D, but they also had enough 2D not to be fully 3D. This is because with the 5th console generation, 2D was a choice and not mandatory, so developers could choose exactly how much of it they wanted in their games and where to use it. Some games went for fully 3D models and environments, some chose 2D environments and 3D models, others chose the inverse. All of this was possible thanks to the absolute power of these new consoles. This freed developers and allowed them to make the games of their dreams. It didn't matter if your dream was to make a 2D or a 3D game, because now, both were possible, and not just the former. This new freedom gave rise to so many absolutely phenomenal and revolutionary games that I could simply not list all of them here. If there was no 3D in the 5th generation, as I've seen some people beg, oh, why didn't it stay 2D for one generation longer? All you would have gotten is gaming that stagnated for over half a decade. And then, once the 6th generation came out with 3D hardware, we'd basically just get the 5th generation games of our timeline, but way later, and with a higher polygon count. It's not like, for instance, Nintendo would have magically gained the experience necessary to make games like Mario Sunshine, Wind Waker, or Metroid Prime if they weren't building off of years of their own experience from making 3D games of their own, and learning from the existing successes in the gaming industry at large. Honestly, we're kind of lucky that Sony wasn't up and not Nintendo in regards of 2D gaming. The PS2 at least got 2D games. Can't say it's the same for the N64. And finally, you can just laugh at people who claim that the 5th generation of systems sucked. Like, you just can. It's true. It's like arguing with a flat earther. I know, misinformation of all kinds these days is just ballooning. But I understand a lot of people don't want to argue with somebody who doesn't want to have their mind changed. You can just laugh at them. They're wrong. You can make fun of them, it's okay. This entire video started because I found somebody's opinions funny, and then I realized there were more people like this. Please, have good video game opinions. Play Panzer Dragoon Saga, something that'll change your life. Changed mine. Bye.